Breaking news, Alabama head coach Nick Saban is retiring. This is a shocker.
Absolutely. And I'm sitting there and I'm like thinking opt-outs, not opt-outs, but transfers and decommits like crazy coming down the pike, I think, for the Alabama Crimson Tide. I mean, if you're a high school kid or a transfer and you're going to play for Nick Saban, all of a sudden this comes out. Now I'm seeing it on the TVs too, so great job by Dustin of getting that before just about everybody. But I was just going to say that, this program was in a world of hurt there for a few years before Saban arrived, and unless they go out and get a Kirby Smart type, it's hard to imagine that they're going to be able to keep around too many of these blue chippers and 4 and 5 stars that they've recruited over the last several months and transfer portal and all that. Do you want to play for Alabama? No offense to Alabama, but do you want to play for him if you committed to play for Nick Saban and now he's gone? And Texas and Oklahoma making the move to the SEC just said, oh, this is great. Couldn't have been any better than, Nick Saban moving on. So I think they got to go after Kirby Smart the best they can. Just throw a fistful of money at him and see if he'll come to Tuscaloosa.
Amal, that's what I said. Kirby. Now, we all have discussed the job that Georgia is, and Kirby's built it into a powerhouse, obviously. I don't think Kirby's going to leave. I don't think Dabo's going to leave, but obviously I had to bring up the two names, Kirby with the connection, many years with Alabama, and Dabo obviously played football there at Alabama.
Yeah, I think Kirby being from Georgia, he's going to stay. I mean, that was probably the dream job at UGA. You mentioned Dabo and what he's done at Clemson. Now, remember, he did play for U of A, so he might consider going back there. But, guys, I can't really think of a name off the top of my head that they would look to hire. Who would be the person to fit in immediately following, obviously, Nick Saban? This is going to be a challenge. And remember, Alabama has had some great successes. You had, obviously, Bear Bryant. Gene Stallings won a national championship there. But then you've had some lean years there as well. Remember Mike DeBose and then, of course, David Shula. So Nick Saban's run, obviously, going to come to an end here. But, I was looking at his numbers. I'm going to throw a quick stat out there. Nick Saban didn't lose 3 games. I mean, you have to go back to the 2010 season. Last 13 years, Bama never lost more than 2 games.
And who wants to be the guy who replaces the ultimate? Yeah. I'm just going to speak from, my own experience growing up in Nebraska and being a Cornhusker fan all of my life. You had a coach who in 25 years never won fewer than 9 games in Tom Osborne. You bring in Frank Solich, and it's like, boy, Frank only goes out and goes like 57 and 18 or whatever it was and gets canned. And do you want to be that guy that replaces one of the greatest coaches, if not the best of all time? Do they go? I mean, I'm just going to throw a couple of names out there. Lane Kiffin, Steve Sarkisian. Guys who've had connections to Alabama in the past, are these guys that maybe the names pop up and, Kiffin might be a far reach, but I'm thinking, do you go out and get a Steve Sarkisian and take him away from Texas?
Patrick, go ahead, Dustin.
So Kiffin, I think it makes sense because Ole Miss, even though they're spending a lot of money in the transfer portal right now and NIL, I think he would make sense. I think Sark is happy at Texas. I think Texas is one of those gigs. It's actually a downgrading job, Texas to Alabama, unless they're going to throw money at him. But Texas has the money to keep him. I think the problem is where we're at right now in the hiring process. A lot of these like sexy names have gotten scooped up. The big coordinators, the people moving up from one program to another. And Alabama's a delusional fan base. I think you always have to keep that in mind with them. They were pretty irrelevant for a long time. They did not matter in the SEC for a very long time till they were able to get rid of Shula, replace him with Saban. Saban took a couple years, and once he got going, it became something like we've never seen before in college football. But Alabama is one of the more overrated jobs in the country when you consider the state of Alabama doesn't have that many people in it.
I agree completely with Dustin in terms of what he just said. I was going to echo the same sentiments. I said David Shula is Mike Shula, but to me, this is not as great of a job as people will think because of the run that Nick Saban had. And I thought Scott put it very well. You don't want to follow. Think about this. Frank Solich never had a losing season at Nebraska. He had only 1 season out of 6 where he didn't win 9 games and they ran him off because Dr. Tom was one of the greatest coaches of all time. And I think that's the challenge here. I think right now when you look at it, Patrick, we had this conversation a few weeks ago, best states to recruit in. We don't have Alabama in that top 5.
Oh, no.
And to me, it's not as coveted of a job when you think about what LSU does, what Georgia does, what Florida could potentially return to. Tennessee's on the rise. I think you need the right coach and the right personality in there. And Scott said it so well. Do you want to follow John Wooden? Do you want to follow Tom Osborne? Those aren't guys you want to follow. Nick Saban is in that same category.
Look, in between Gene Stallings, who obviously had a connection, but Mike DeBoer, as Amal mentioned, Dennis Francione, remember? Mike Price didn't actually coach a game because he was hanging out with Dustin at the script club. Mike Shula, and then Nick Saban. So the Saban hire lets you know that Alabama, you don't have to have a connection to the school. So I'll give you the name, and I think it's the name they have to go after and just say, blank check, please, we're begging you, leave Washington, Kalen DeBoer, and come to Alabama for the next 20 years. It's your job if you want it. Go for it. That's what I
You know what else
boys.
about DeBoer? That's a great name to throw out there.
Number one.
Yeah, and I agree. And he's used to not having – I mean, he doesn't have a big recruiting base. He's sitting in a state that's next to Idaho and Wyoming and Oregon, and those states don't bring a great recruiting base as far as high school football players are concerned, obviously, because of their population. So he's already used to – not having a lot to work with as far as recruits are concerned. I think that's a great fit if they can bring him in.
Those kids who go to Washington have to go multiple states for their family to watch them play. Sure. They have to get on planes.
Yep.
At least in Alabama, if he's recruiting Georgia,
sure.
and whatever states, Mississippi that are nearby, it's a car ride for them on a Saturday. They're back Sunday and at work on Monday. It's a totally different style of recruiting. When I saw this was open, when Saban was stepping down, Kalen DeBoer with a bullet was number one on the list. I think you have to, and now's the time to get him when he has to rebuild that receiving core at Washington. They're going to get hit with a ton of guys going to the draft. For him, he has to capitalize on that, and if Alabama comes offering, well, I just said it's an overrated job, it's still a better job than Washington, and he will be the highest paid state employee in the state of Alabama.
You guys make great points on Kalen DeBoer, and I think he'd be an excellent choice. Now, from Kalen DeBoer's perspective, I would argue, do you want to go to Tuscaloosa? He's a guy that grew up in South Dakota. Now he's at Washington. Remember, he had to stop at Indiana as an OC and then at Fresno State as a head coach. So that's the first question. The second thing I would point to and say, there's a lot less pressure at Washington than there is at Alabama. You have one of the most beautiful campuses in America. You are in an absolute huge metropolis in Seattle. Do you want to make that move to a smaller town where every decision you make is going to be absolutely analyzed and dissected every time? Where at UW, you're going to get great support, but they're not going to run you off if you go 9-3.
And you know one thing you mentioned about DeBoer and where he's from, I think Saban's just amazing, but being a regional fit for a personality is important to a certain extent. I still think he's the best option, but I'll say real quickly, I was having dinner one night, guys, with John Makovic, the former Texas Longhorns coach. And we're sitting there and we're talking, and he said, and he didn't mean this, and I kind of brought up the little analysis on this one or whatever, and I said it seemed like when you were at Texas, you found success, you did. However, you're a wine and cheese guy. And back then when he was coaching in Austin, that was a beer and hot dogs, a beer and pork rinds job. And he was wine and cheese. And you got to make sure his personality can handle and fit. You can go 8-4 one year at Washington and nobody's going to complain. You can't go 8-4 one year at Alabama after what Saban's done.
And Patrick, just to add, we already saw this type of situation. It's not completely the same. Brian Harsin went from Boise State down to Auburn, and it was culturally just not a fit.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. My assumption is Saban has already handpicked his successor.
I would agree.
I think there's something to that. That would be my guess. The name that's going to be floated mostly would be Lane Kiffin, who went to Nick Saban rehab and flipped it to the Ole Miss job. Flipped it to the Florida, he went to Florida Atlantic first, and then flipped it to Ole Miss. I think that would be a grave mistake. He's a wildly overrated coach, in my opinion. It'll be fascinating. It really will be fascinating. I think if you just want the best football coach, I think Kalen DeBoer is the answer. Dustin had him one as well. And I don't think history with the program matters. Nick Saban had nothing to do with the school. And he's gone on to essentially pass Bear Bryant. There's already a statue there in Tuscaloosa. All right, so if you're just joining us, we'll continue with the handicapping. Certainly huge news, and that is Nick Saban, six-time national champ at Alabama, is retiring as a head football coach at the University of Alabama. We're coming back with Scott Spreitzer next. A busy week, certainly with Wild Card Weekend coming up, but a busy day. You wanted to top Mike Vrabel being let go by the Titans yesterday, so the Seattle Seahawks said, hold our beer, and they, I guess, mutually agreed to part ways with a legend there up in Seattle, and that is Pete Carroll. And then a bombshell. Dustin had his mouth agape. It was hanging like a hand dog, like a dog. Like it was, and Scott Spreitzer in the middle of the Pittsburgh Buffalo handicap said, "Big guy, you okay?" The big guy came on and told us, "I'm not," because there was no, it's interesting. There was no retirement tour. Think Coach K, where Coach K said 17 years out, I'm thinking about retiring, so get ready. Nick Saban is retiring as the head football coach there at Alabama, 6-time national champ. Probably the GOAT. He and Bear Bryant, that's the conversation. That's the school. So our conversation now turns to who will replace him. Dabo had been long thought potentially the replacement, but he's a legend at Clemson. Of course, the wide receiver there at Alabama. Kirby Smart was a longtime defensive coordinator, an assistant under Nick Saban, but the Georgia job is just a better job, and he's built a powerhouse. He's not going to leave Athens. Dustin just texted me, where does Alabama rank in just the new look SEC? Maybe we can have that conversation, boys, just as a job. Remove the Bear Bryant stigma along with Nick Saban. Where does the Alabama job rank in the SEC?
I remember we did the kind of a debate on this one. I think we had it somewhere between 3 and 5 in the SEC. And I would probably stick by that. I think Georgia, Florida, and LSU, in my estimation, are still better jobs in the Southeastern Conference. And now you throw in Texas, I think Alabama pushes somewhere out to 5 or 6.
The age is interesting here too, boys, because Nick Saban's 72. He's retired. Pete Carroll's 72. He just stepped down as the head coach. Bill Belichick, 71, and there's a question mark. What will happen with Bill Belichick, who apparently has been begging the Crafts to let him stick around Foxborough? Big guy, you and I agree. We both want – I don't even think it's a question. If Kalen DeBoer would come, you roll out the red carpet and you just fall all over yourself. There's no connection to Alabama. That doesn't matter. There wasn't a connection with Nick Saban. DeBoer just lost his 12th game as a head coach. That's insane. What else you got there, big guy?
He's 49 years old as well. Some other names I'd like to throw at you guys. You tell me your vibe when I throw the name at you. And look, we can say they may not leave the job they're going to, but they need to be in the mix for this, and I think they will interview. You guys mentioned Dabo, so we'll skip it. Dan Lanning. How can Dan Lanning and what he does defensively, especially the way he built up Bo Nix, how can Dan Lanning not be one of the top 3 candidates for the Alabama job now?
I was just going to say I'll make it's probably too heavy of a favorite, but I'll make DeBoer plus 350 as the favorite. I'll come back with Lanning as maybe plus 550 as the second favorite, and I like that quite a bit because he's proven what he can do on both sides of the line of scrimmage. He knows the kind of coordinator that fits what he wants to do, which is like DeBoer. DeBoer goes out and gets guys who are going to fit with him. Just real quick, you mentioned Belichick, and I just wanted to mention, and everybody's probably talked about this on this show. His win percentage as an NFL head coach before and after Brady is like .450. I just don't get this whole Belichick love. I mean, it was great when Brady was there. He had the right assistants, but no more. But anyway, as far as back to that question, I would put Lanning up there. Kiffin's in that top 5 or 6. I think he has to be, even though I don't think Alabama. I agree with Patrick. I don't think Alabama should go after Lane Kiffin. I really don't. But he would have to be top 5 or 6 for me.
Well, how about this? The biggest challenge right now in the SEC overall, forget divisions, for Alabama is Georgia and what Georgia has built. Kirby came from Saban.
Sure.
Lanning comes from Kirby.
Right.
Who better to go after your enemy than someone who knows how he operates?
Sure. No, it's another great coach to throw out there.
Real quick, Lanning's got a $20 million buyout.
That's okay. You want to win football games in Alabama? That's what you got to do.
That's not much. That's not a lot for Alabama. For an Alabama program. I mean, if Texas A&M can pay $70 million for a buyout,
well, listen, A&M has oil money and they're delusional.
Yeah, but they paid a lot of those contracts
because they're delusional.
I think they're still paying Kevin Sumlin right now.
One thing we do know as far as PR, that Lanning is very concerted. He went on the national championship broadcast to raise his Q rating. We know that's what you do. There's no need to do it. He chose to do so. His press conferences this year built steam, right? He was talking social issues. He was, backing up his players. He knew there was a bit of a grandstanding element to Lanning, so I believe he wants to be bigger than he already is. He's got a good job at Oregon. It's not the best job in college football. And how old is he? 37, 38?
DeBoer's 49. So Dan Lanning is younger. Dan Lanning's 37. Yeah. So Dan Lanning is a year, 2 years younger than me. I think there's a very
that's ego.
Yeah. But just to show you how mature he is, right? He considers the things I say. And
you're a good coach too.
Yeah, I am a good coach. You should see my Madden record. Kalen DeBoer, Dabo Sweeney, Dan Lanning. That's the top three. Jed Fish outside of the box. I'm going to say a name right now that's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable, but he's absolutely going to get interviewed for this job. And everyone loves to crush him, and everyone loves to root against him, and that's part of why he would be a guy to go here. I'm talking about Deion Sanders.
They're not bringing in Deion.
Oh, he's in the commercials with Saban, too. There's a connection. They seem like they get along. That's an interesting name.
Deion's a smart guy, but I don't know. I mean, do you go after him? He's unproven so far.
Yeah, that's why I don't understand the affinity for Dan Lanning. I mean, if you look at Dan Lanning and say, okay, great. You beat Lincoln Riley, who hasn't this last couple of seasons. You're 0-3 against Kalen DeBoer. So are you going to beat Kirby Smart now?
I like what Patrick said about Lanning, though. I mean, look, it's bringing up Deion. Look what he said. I mean, he wants – I'm not going to say Oregon's not a great job. It is. He wants bigger and better things. I mean, when you see what he did with Deion, you know, we play for wins. They play for clicks. Yeah. You know, I mean – boy, he just seems like he's a little bit more out there, and I don't mean that in a bad way, a little bit more out there as far as making himself accessible. The Deion mention, I mean, he's got the connection with Saban from working with him on TV a little bit, but I keep thinking he's got to prove himself. And so far, he's totally ignoring the traditional recruiting, and he's just going after again this year.
I agree.
Nothing but transfer portals.
But he will be interviewed. And then, are these two names sexy enough? One of them just took a job. One said he won't take a job. I think we all agree they're both great football coaches, but I don't know if they're sexy enough for Alabama, but they could get in the mix depending on how this thing shakes out. Lance Leipold.
He's kind of old, isn't he? Like about 60.
Yeah, he's about 60.
And then Jonathan Smith, who just went to Michigan State. I don't think he's done enough yet to warrant Alabama, but if they were buying low, that would be the name. I don't know if it's as simple as Steve Sarkisian used to coach here. He's going to be an option. Lane Kiffin was the heir apparent under Saban for all those years. He's just going to come over. I don't think it's that simple.
That would be so goofy. If they hire Kiffin, that would be the goofiest
I don't think they're hiring
Saban of all time.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I don't think they're hiring either of those guys, Sark or Kiff.
Yeah. I mean,
guys, it's only one. I'm sorry. DeBoer is the answer. It's the only answer, Dustin. Look, Deion's an interesting name, and I agree. I think there will be, even just to do him a favor. We talked about it a little bit during the break, boys. Do you disagree with my assertion that Saban's a calculated person, and he cares about legacy? I believe he's already handpicked his successor. I think there's something to that.
I wouldn't doubt that at all.
Well, if he cares about legacy, then bring in Sark. They'll be 7-7 in 2 seasons.
Well, I agree with you. I think he knows Sark isn't that good. And I think Lane's the same. You know, Lane would recruit there. We know that. But DeBoer, if you want to keep it, you know, kind of consistent as far as just a medium personality that's not going to embarrass the university and win a ton of football games, it's Kalen DeBoer.
What about a great coach who's not coaching right now? He's won a national title. He coached under
Jimbo
Nick
Fisher. There's 0%.
I'm messing with you.
If Saban is co-signing, there's a 0% chance he allows Jimbo Fisher to follow him. They can't stand each other. To me, it's 3 names. It's DeBoer, it's Dabo, it's Dan Lanning. That's it. Those are the 3 targets you have to go after. Kalen DeBoer and Dan Lanning do not want to be in the Big Ten next year, playing all the way in the Pacific Northwest.
You guys really don't think that Kirby's – I mean, it comes to this.
No. Kirby Smart.
You really don't think he's going to even think about it.
His dad's a legend in Georgia high school. He played at UGA.
Wouldn't you offer him the state? I mean, just
but Georgia's actually a better job than Bama.
Well, I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying I would throw as every penny I have to try to get him, and he could refuse it.
Yeah, sure. And I think Dan Lanning might refuse it as well.
Trust me, if Georgia lost what they had with Kirby, the state government would have a state of emergency to say, we've got to declare the Kirby Smart Day here. We've got to pay him.
My gut tells me Dustin's right. I think it's going to be Dan Lanning. I got a weird vibe.
Go to VSiN.com/subscribe to become a VSiN Pro subscriber today.